You might be like I used to be and think nothing about the destruction of the temple after Jesus rose from the dead. But then again, you might be someone who's always wondered about it. Many Christians don't know that the destruction of the temple did not just end animal sacrifices. It drastically changed Judaism forever. Judaism itself became almost unrecognizable compared to what it had been before. The priesthood was destroyed, rabbinic Judaism would rise, the scriptures changed forever, and Judaism would shift to specifically erase any thought of Jesus being the Messiah. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on what happened and why it matters even now.
Welcome to Between the Lines, where we dive deeper into Scripture and uncover what's hidden between the lines. I'm Chris Adams. Thank you for joining me, and let's get into the message.
In 70 AD, the first Jewish war ended with the destruction of the temple by soon-to-be Emperor Titus. During this time, Jerusalem was not the place to be. As Josephus writes, based on eyewitness accounts, there was a certain woman that dwelt beyond the Jordan, having boiled her own child and having eaten one half of him and having kept the other half by her concealed. This woman, like many, had come to Jerusalem for Passover, but when the Romans surrounded the city, she was caught inside the city walls. And this time, Israel was in full rebellion, having rejected Jesus as Messiah, having rebelled against the Roman Empire, and having rebelled against God. The word that God spoke to the children of Israel through Moses in Deuteronomy 28:53 came to pass. You shall eat the fruit of your own body, the flesh of your sons and your daughters, whom the Lord your God has given you, in the siege of desperate straits in which your enemy shall distress you. This is one of the curses that is mentioned in Deuteronomy 28 when the children of Israel refused to obey the voice of God and his commands. Of course, there was the destruction of the temple. And though many may think that Titus intentionally wanted to destroy the temple, as Josephus writes, that wasn't the case. In the Jewish war, he states that the temple was actually set ablaze by two soldiers. And General Titus, as he was at the time, actually ran to stop them, but he was too late. He even writes that as the temple was going up in flames, Titus raised his hands to heaven, calling God as a witness that he was not responsible for the destruction. The destruction of Jerusalem was so bad that those who dug up the foundation found that there was nothing left for anyone to believe that there was anything there to begin with. This fulfilled what Jesus said in Matthew 24:2. Not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. And the number of those dead ranges from the hundreds of thousands to over 1 million people. Remember that the temple was destroyed as pilgrims were in the city for Passover. These weren't just the residents of Jerusalem, but Jews from all over the nation. But the destruction of the temple wasn't just physical. The spiritual aftershocks would change the face of Judaism forever. This is what Judaism was coming out of after the destruction of the temple. It was not a good time to be a Jew. It was not a good time to be in Israel. The Roman Empire was merciless in crushing this rebellion. Of course, it all ended in Masada in 73 AD with the mass suicide of Jewish rebels. Without the priesthood, a new power would rise, but it wouldn't look anything like the Judaism Moses had handed down. With the destruction of the temple, you no longer needed the priesthood, as there was nothing for them to do. This is when the leadership authority of Judaism shifted from the priesthood to the rabbis. Specifically, you had people like Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, who brokered a sort of peace with Rome to allow the establishment of a Jewish academy in the city of Yavne after the destruction of the temple. Zakkai would become very instrumental in shaping Judaism after the temple, especially in how the scriptures were interpreted, as we're going to see in a moment. But as Rome was destroying Jerusalem, Zakkai had the foresight to understand that the temple was going to be destroyed as well, and that Judaism, if it was to survive, needed to transform. So he helped to restructure it to focus on Torah study, communal prayer, and synagogue worship. Zakkai and others did this because after the destruction of the temple, there was a massive theological crisis. With no altar, no priest, and no way to offer sin offerings, how could they still claim to follow God's commands? Well, They turned to scriptures like Hosea 6:6, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and Psalms 51, where David wrote that a broken and contrite heart was the true offering God desired. Prayer, Torah study, fasting, and acts of mercy were reinterpreted as spiritual replacements for the sacrifices, allowing Judaism to survive without the temple for centuries. This was meant to be a temporary change, but as it became clear that the temple was not going to be rebuilt immediately, this became permanent. Have you ever thought about how hard it would be to suddenly have to replace everything you believed about worship? Let me know what you think. Christians, of course, at the time, and even now, point to this being a sign that God was done with animal sacrifice, that Jesus was the final sacrifice. Because even though you may want to replace blood sacrifice with Torah study, prayer, worship, and fasting, as Hebrews 9:22 says, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission. But even though there was this new form of Judaism that was rising from the ashes of the temple, they still had to deal with the problem of Christianity. It was quickly growing and spreading across Israel and the known world, and something had to be done about it. Many Jews were quickly realizing that Jesus was the Messiah and abandoning the old ways to follow Jesus. Although synagogues originally started in Babylon as a place where the Israelites together and worship God and read the Torah, when they returned to Israel to build the temple under Zerubbabel, they brought the idea of the synagogue with them. It wasn't a replacement for the temple, but an accompaniment for the temple. However, after the destruction of the temple, it became its replacement. Synagogues would be the place where the Jewish people would come on a daily basis for prayer, Torah readings, and fellowship with other Jews. We may think of Judaism as a religion that doesn't evangelize, but that hasn't always been the case. In fact, Jesus ridicules the Jewish Pharisees in Matthew 23:15 for evangelizing only to make the convert twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. However, after the destruction of the temple, the focus was turned from expanding Judaism to making sure it survived. Of course, later there would be laws put in place that would make it illegal and punishable by death to evangelize and make converts to Judaism. But that's a whole other podcast. So, part of helping Judaism survive, separate themselves from this growing Christian religion, and help create a strong Jewish identity was this something called the BIRKAT HAMIMIM, or translated as curse against the sectarians. This was a specific blessing and cursing prayer that was inserted into the daily Amidah, or standing prayer, that was said 3 times a day. The Amidah contained 18 blessings and later expanded to 19, and the BIRKAT HAMIMIM was one of them. The purpose of this prayer was to identify and expel heretics from Jewish worship gatherings, especially Jewish Christians, who still worshipped in the synagogues. Imagine being forced to stand and curse your own faith in a public prayer. It's kind of hard to wrap our minds around today. After the destruction of the temple, Jewish Christians still consider themselves Jews and still wanted to worship in the synagogue. However, they saw Jesus as the Messiah and they tell people about him. This became a problem for the rabbinic authorities. This prayer became a way to force public loyalty to Judaism, so that Christians or other heretics, as they were seen, would have to curse themselves or be identified and removed. Now, originally, this prayer was to target Jewish Christians, or Nazarenes as they were called, Gnostics, Samaritans, and other heretical Jewish groups. But over time, the main concern were these Christians. This prayer remained until the Middle Ages, when it was softened to drop the part about the Nazarenes and just use the general heretic or slanderers language. This was due to Christian political pressure and a desire to avoid persecution. Even though the language has become even more vague and does not specifically target Christians, the standing daily prayer still includes a curse for slanderers and enemies of God. I do want to take a moment here for you to understand something. Even though Judaism was making these changes to push Christianity away from Judaism, as time went on, Christians did the same thing. The difference was that the Jewish leaders were the ones who instituted this separation, and in many cases, the downright hatred of the Christians. Christians, on the other hand, departed from the teachings of Jesus to walk in love and did their part to cause a deeper divide between the two groups. I just want to make it clear, it's not as if Christians were totally innocent throughout history for this divide. However, it did start in Judaism with rabbinic leadership trying to separate themselves from what they saw as a heretical splinter group. And if you mention separation, I have to let you know that you don't want to be separated from our upcoming episodes. So make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know what you think of this episode so far. Did you know that the majority of the people that listen to multiple podcasts right here aren't even subscribed? You don't want to miss what's coming up in the future. Okay, now let's get back to the other giant change that was made. So during the time of Jesus and the destruction of the temple, there was no Hebrew Masoretic text. However, the Greek Septuagint, a collection of translations already in use, was widespread by Jesus' day. However, there was no complete official Jewish Bible. Jewish communities used a variety of Hebrew scrolls. Some aligned with what would later become the Masoretic family. Some aligned with Hebrew base that would become the Septuagint. Some scrolls were a mixture or a paraphrase. So what are these foreign words, Septuagint and Masoretic? Well, these are the two major translation languages of the Old Testament, with Masoretic being the standard Hebrew verse that is accepted by Judaism today and has been for about 2,000 years. The Septuagint was the Greek translation of the Old Testament that first began to be translated around 250 BC in Alexandria, Egypt. This was primarily for Greek-speaking Jews. By Jesus' time, the Greek Septuagint was already in widespread use. The Torah and most of the prophets were fully translated, and many of the writings were available in Greek, though not yet finalized as a fixed canon. It wasn't a single book, but a growing collection of the scriptures that Christians would use to show that Jesus fulfilled the Messianic prophecies. During Jesus' time, there was no single official Bible text, Greek or Hebrew. The Jews of Jerusalem used Hebrew scrolls that weren't yet standardized. Some matched what would later be known as the Masoretic text, but others matched the Septuagint, the very scriptures that Christians would later use to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. It was only after the destruction of the temple that Jewish leaders pushed for a single Hebrew standard, in part to distance themselves from Christian claims. And this came in 85 to 90 AD when Jewish leaders began discussions to standardize Judaism in the city of Yavne. This is another event where Rabbi Yohan ben Zakkai would become influential. It was at this council that rabbis began to strongly respond to Christianity. They started standardizing Hebrew scriptures, favoring only Hebrew over Greek versions. They started to define proper books, which later led to the Hebrew Bible canon. Some books they rejected, some they reinterpreted. Many of these books were rejected, questioned, or reinterpreted because they were too closely associated with Messianic claims, or quoted by early Christians, or contained resurrection themes. And they started formally to reject the Septuagint because Christians used it to prove Jesus is the Messiah. Of course, the complete finalization of the Masoretic text wouldn't happen for centuries later, but it all started here. And understand that Christians adopted the Septuagint because it was the common Jewish Bible of their world, and because its wording pointed to Jesus so clearly. Jewish authorities would later totally reject it solely because Christians were using it. They weren't rejecting it because it was inaccurate, but specifically because those that they saw as heretics were using it to prove their case that Jesus was the Messiah. Understand that before Jesus came and started to use the Greek version of the scriptures, Jewish authorities were very positive about it and saw it as a miraculous event that the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek. It was said that the Jewish translators were inspired by God and that all copies agreed word for word with the Hebrew. Until Christianity started to grow, there was no widespread Jewish rejection of the Septuagint. It was widely used for teaching, reading, and worship, especially outside of Jerusalem. Now, there was some preferences, such as the Temple Scrolls practice and the Qumran writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but as far as anyone can tell, historically speaking, this was a cultural bias, not a rejection of Greek. Now, why does this matter, Septuagint or Masoretic? It's because the Septuagint translates key messianic prophecies in a way that clearly supports key claims of who Jesus is. For example, it translates Isaiah 7:14 as a virgin instead of a young woman like the Masoretic text. The New Testament writings like Matthew, the Apostle Paul, and the author of Hebrews, and including Jesus, quoted scripture that is more in line with the Septuagint wording than the Hebrew versions that are available. You need to understand that the Septuagint is just as accurate as the Hebrew text that existed at the time of Jesus. The Dead Sea Scrolls, first discovered in 1947 and dated between the 3rd century BC and 1st century AD, showed that multiple Hebrew traditions existed side by side with the Greek. The Hebrew that exists in those scrolls accurately matches the Septuagint, proving that there was no corruption of the scriptures on the part of the Christians. It's important to note that when the Jewish leaders rejected the Septuagint and favoring the Hebrew-only Bible, they were disconnecting themselves from a very large Greek-speaking Jewish world. That Greek-speaking Jewish world had been a major part of Judaism beforehand. Those Greek-speaking Jews, now left out in the cold, so to speak, were more open to the gospel message because they knew the Greek Septuagint that the Christians were preaching. In a later episode, we're going to go into exactly how some of these scriptures that the Jewish leadership didn't like were reinterpreted to try and disprove Jesus as the Messiah. If you made it this far, I want to say thank you, and as a thank you, I want to offer you some free downloads. Check the description below and you will find a link to 3 different downloads, a timeline of the destruction of the temple and what happened afterwards, a handout for the scriptures that the Jewish leaders used to transition from animal sacrifices to Torah reading and the other things that they did, and also a quote sheet of what Josephus said about the destruction of the temple and what was going on in Jerusalem at that time. Again, thanks for listening, and let's get back to it. Even though these were the major changes that took place, they weren't the only ones. Rabbinic leaders instituted tighter regulations and rules for daily life. There were stricter rules for the Sabbath, stricter rules for dietary laws, and other areas. Before Jesus, the Sabbath observances followed biblical mandates, emphasized rest and holiness, but it did have some regional variations and less detailed restrictions. Before Jesus, the Sabbath observances followed biblical mandates, emphasized rest and holiness, but it did have some regional variations and less detailed restrictions. However, to counter Christian practices of gathering on Sundays, rabbinic authorities heightened Sabbath regulations and distinctions. New regulations were instituted, such as lighting Sabbath candles. And after the rise of Christianity, and especially Paul's explicit teaching against the necessity of dietary restrictions for Gentiles, Rabbinic Judaism intensified their dietary observances. This, again, was to show a distinct separation between Judaism and Christianity, and make it harder for Jews to fellowship with Christians. And while circumcision was primarily a covenant sign before Jesus, it was traditionally practiced with moderate uniformity and little active confrontation by religious leadership. However, after Jesus, Jewish leadership emphasized that circumcision was absolutely essential for Jewish identity, and it was strictly enforced. They even labeled deviating from it as a sign of heresy and apostasy. It was clear, to be Jewish was to be circumcised. And then there was the changes to Passover. Before the destruction of the temple, it was celebrated primarily to commemorate the Exodus from Egypt, and it involved lamb sacrifice in the temple. After the temple, it moved to home-based Seder dinners and focused heavily on the Exodus, and downplayed any Messianic symbolism. Rabbis intentionally stopped eating roasted lamb. Of course, the reasoning was because of the loss of the temple, but it was also rejecting Jesus as the final sacrificial lamb. With all of these changes, what about their hope for a Messiah? Well, that was about to change as well. And that's what we're going to look at next time. Because there was a major event that wasn't even related to Jesus or Christianity that would forever change the Jewish interpretation of who the Messiah would be. You don't want to miss that episode because we're going to answer very clearly why modern Jews don't even consider Jesus to be the Messiah. If you haven't subscribed, now is the time to do so you don't miss that episode. Make sure to hit the notification button as well. And if you found this interesting, drop a comment and let me know. Thank you for joining me. And remember, if God said it, I believe it, and that settles it.
Thank you for tuning in to Between the Lines. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a comment. And if you want to dive even deeper into the study of Scripture, connect with me on social media and join the conversation. Until next time, stay with the Word and the Spirit.